Welcome. I'm Dr. Frank Conner, and I'm the chair of the psychology department. I want to welcome all of you again to the psychology department speaker series. This is the second of four, the second one of this semester. Next semester, hope to see you at one or both of our presentations. You can get the dates on the psychology department website, but so you can think about it. The first one next semester is in February, and it's a presentation on, we'll have a sex therapist who's a practicing sex therapist who's going to come. And then in March, we will have a pediatric psychologist from Spectrum who deals with stress and anxiety in adolescence and young adulthood. And he will come and maybe for some of you give some practical insight in how to managing as we're moving into exam week. And I know stress is, okay, exam week's a couple of weeks out. Don't freak out yet, but we're moving towards the end of the semester. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Robert Diener. Dr. Diener is an associate professor of psychology at Grand Valley State University. Dr. Diener did his undergraduate work at Colgate, and his PhD is from Duke. Please welcome Dr. Diener.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I don't know if the mic is working, but maybe I don't need it. All right. It's not?
It's working, but it might need...
Maybe closer?
Right down.
All right. Turn it that way. Better? Okay, good. Thanks, Frank. Thanks also, Kate, Eric. I had a wonderful lunch, and it's truly a pleasure to be here at GRCC. I have very good feelings about the college. I've eaten at the Heritage Restaurant many times and loved it. My wife teaches here in the writing department. Is anybody skipping Miss Lutwick-Diener's class right now? She's teaching class right now. And many of my best students have done work at GRCC, and I'll actually tell you about a few of them as we discuss the research today. So it's truly a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So I'm going to give a lecture today about sex differences in sports. But before I begin, I want to promote a little engagement. So we'll do a little activity. Okay. Let's see if I can. How do I go next? This one?
The left button.
The left button? There we go. All right, so we're going to have a pop quiz. Some of you are like, oh, which class is it going to count for? It's not going to be for your classes. But it's just to get your views so I can get a sense of where you're coming from, okay? So we're going to do this with a show of hands, no fancy technology. So the first is a question, a multiple choice question. In sprinting, such as running the 100-meter dash, about how much faster are the fastest men in the world compared to the fastest women in the world? So by a show of hands, I want you to all vote A, B, C, D, or E, okay? How many would go for A, 2 to 4%? Okay, a few hands there. How about B? Okay, a popular one, 6 to 8%. C, 10 to 12. Okay. And D, 14 to 16. A few 14 to 16. E, 18 to 20. Okay. The correct answer is C, and you guys did a great job on that. Okay, that was the majority of the room. Okay, so men have roughly 5 times as much circulating testosterone in their tissues, and this leads to a lot of physiological advantages, including more muscle and less body fat. This is why people, of course, want to take additional testosterone if they want to improve their athletic performance. How about distance running? Same question, but instead of the 100-meter dash, think about the marathon, some 26 miles. Again, show of hands. A. How about B? Okay, some for B. C. D. Okay, so, and E. So this time C and D were about equally popular, and the correct answer is C. There's about a 10 to 12% gap there as well. And again, more muscle, less body fat, that's a big part of it. And men also have cardiovascular advantages, which are also related to testosterone, including having more red blood cells and more hemoglobin, the stuff that carries oxygen in those blood cells. All right, here's another one, another comparison. This is the last comparison, in case you're wondering. In terms of upper body strength, about how much stronger on average are men compared to women? Okay. And again, show of hands, how about A, 2%? How about B, 10%? Okay, B. Okay. How about C, 25%? Popular one. How about D, 45%? Okay, probably the most popular. E, anybody with that one? Okay, a few people with E. Okay. Oops, hold on, I went too far. How do I go backwards? Hold on, I just missed the key, this slide here. Let me see. All right, there we go. Well, the correct answer is E. So these two guys got it right. And what I'm showing here is the distribution in a large population. The idea is that there's a bell-shaped curve. Most individuals have about average strength. Some people are exceptionally strong. Some people are pretty weak. But the distributions for men and women don't overlap that much. Obviously, they do overlap. But the point is that about 99% of men are stronger than the average woman. Okay, so it's a pretty big difference here, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, historical question. So the men's marathon has been in the Olympics, the modern Olympics, ever since 1896. Right? How about women's Olympic marathon? When was that first introduced as an event? It wasn't there in 1896. Was it introduced in A, 1924? Okay, people say that. How about B, 1964? Okay. How about C, 1984? Okay. And then D, 2004. A few people. Okay, the correct answer on this one was C. Okay, so most of you did that one pretty well. So Joan Benoit, an American from Maine, won that first women's marathon in 1984 at the Los Angeles Games. Okay. Now, a follow-up question. If Joan Benoit, the champion, was in her prime today, at her best, how would she do compared to the best current American women, such as Shailene Flanagan? Right? Would she be A, in the top 3? How many would go for A in the top 3? How many would say B in the top 10? Okay, some top 10. How about in the top 50? A popular one. And how about D in the top 200? Okay. Another surprise. She'd be in the top 3. In fact, she'd be number 1. Okay. Her record was broken by Dina Castor, although Dina Castor's retired. So she'd be faster than any American woman today. In fact, there's only 1 or 2 women in the world faster than Joan Benoit at her best. Okay. We'll talk about her a little bit more later on. Her times were staggering, even at that time. All right, next question. This one's getting a little bit more difficult. Right. Some people say that men and boys are generally more interested in sports than girls and women. In reality, we got 5 questions here going from girls and women are most interested down to boys and men are most interested. So how many would go for A, girls and women are much more interested? How about B, girls and women slightly more interested? C, there's no sex difference. Okay, pretty popular. How about D, boys and men slightly more interested? Okay. And how about E, boys and men much more interested? So a pretty diverse group there. Quite a few for C and some for D and E as well. Okay, so this question really is the heart of the talk today. I'm going to show you a lot of data because there isn't really a clear answer. Well, hopefully I'll convince you there is a clear answer by the end of the talk today. But it's a contentious issue. It's not anything like when did the first Olympic marathon happen for women, right? That's a clear yes and no. This one's not so clear, but it's contentious. So most scholars who teach courses on sex and gender differences or teach things about sports would say there's no difference. The U.S. courts say there's no difference or no intrinsic difference. So this is a quote from the U.S. Supreme Court's opinion from an important case in the 1990s. And the idea is basically that if women aren't participating as much, it's not because they're not as interested, it's because they've had fewer opportunities. Okay? And some people, such as the advocacy group, the Women's Sports Foundation, would go further and say there's no difference today at all. Right? So this is a very important group. It has big influence on the Supreme Court and on the United Nations. Very influential. And there's an area of their website where it says research. And in that area, there's a thing that's called myth and facts. And you'll find this thing here. It says a myth. Girls are not as interested as boys in playing sports. And by labeling it a myth, they're saying it's not true, right? In truth, there is no difference. Okay? So for most smart people today, scholars, lobbyists, professors, the correct answer is C. There's no difference, or soon there won't be. But I'm going to try to convince you that, in fact, the data suggests something really different. That, in fact, there's a pretty big difference, and it's unlikely to go away. It might get a little smaller, but it's unlikely to completely go away because it has a partly evolved basis, a partly biological basis. So we're going to talk about that today. But before we do, I want to put all this in a larger context. Okay? So the second part of the title here is Gender and the Myth of the Blank Slate. And I suppose that a lot of you don't know what I'm talking about when I say the myth of the blank slate. So I want to unpack that a little bit for you. Okay. So to begin with, we have to realize that most contemporary people recognize that human nature and our behaviors are some combination of nature and nurture, right? So you take language. Why am I speaking in English? Why do you understand me? Well, it's because we all grew up with this language, or many of us did at least, right? So it comes easy to us. That's the language we speak. But it's not all the environment, right? There's other creatures which could be exposed to English, and they'll never get full-blown human language. Take your chimpanzee, right? They might develop some amazing feats, but they don't develop full-blown language. So you need both the inborn dispositions or the genes, the nature, and the nurture to understand it. So for each individual behavior or tendency, there's always nature and nurture involved. But when you're talking about why do different people differ from each other, you can talk about how nature or nurture might be more or less important, right? So I'm about 6 feet tall. Both of my brothers are about 5'9". Why am I taller than them? Is it because my parents fed me more than them? I don't think so, right? It's probably the genetic deck got shuffled a little bit differently, and that's why I ended up a little bit taller than them. But for other people, why are people whose parents were from Mexico and grew up in the United States, why are they on average about 6 inches taller than their parents? It's probably not because their genes changed, right? It's because their nutrition and their health care changed, right? So you can talk about differences between groups or individuals as being mostly due to nature or mostly due to nurture. So you really have to look at the data in each case. Now, the blank slate refers to the idea that some people take an extreme nurture position and claim that human nature and human behavior is wholly shaped, completely shaped by the environment, right? And individuals have no inborn mental faculties, they have no talents that are special to them. All we have is general learning ability, and the environment writes upon our blank slate, our blank canvas of our brain, if you will, right? The environment inscribes itself upon us. Our minds are clean when we are born. So this blank slate view dominated the early 20th century social sciences. By social sciences, I mean psychology, anthropology, sociology. This is a very dominant view. You can think about this in terms of operant conditioning or classical conditioning, which I'm sure you still emphasize in your classes, really important processes. They're important today, but in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they really tended to dominate the focus of research and teaching in psychology to a great degree. And these were very much blank slate kinds of theories. This is a famous quote by John Watson, and the gist of it is, give me a healthy infant and allow me to control the environment, and I can make him into anything I wish. All that matters is the environment. There's no such thing as talents that can possibly override this. Okay? So we see that in psychology, the dominance of behaviorism, the emphasis on general learning mechanisms. In anthropology, we can see the influence of the blank slate in the emphasis on cultural variability, how limitless it is, how incredibly flexible human behavior it is. Right? And again, anthropologists would document there's a new society here that we've shown that has a really strange ritual, or their customs are so much different than ours. So for instance, the Tassidae of the Philippines were discussed with great interest because they apparently have no words for war or enemy. Isn't that amazing? Can't we learn so much from them? Right? So anthropologists have really celebrated the exotic and focused on that. Or at least they certainly did to a great extent in the early 20th century. This is a movie that kind of illustrates this. It's not a fantastic movie. I don't know if it's wildly hilarious, but it's a pretty entertaining movie. And the gist of it is that it's an anthropologist who has a research grant to go do research in New Guinea, but he's unsuccessful in terms of contacting the people, doesn't get any research done. He comes home and blows all of his money doing lots of things, sometimes taking care of his kids, but he blows all the money, and then he's got to give a report on the research grant. And he kind of panics, and he convinces his new girlfriend, his wife passed away, his girlfriend and his children to dress up, and they develop all these funny rituals, right? And because of this, he becomes celebrated as a fantastic anthropologist, right? The idea being that if you can show something as exotic, you're going to get a lot of attention and notoriety in anthropology. So we see this emphasis in the blank slate that really humans can really do anything. There's limitless variability. We're learners par excellence. Now, there is important and fascinating variability across cultures. So if you haven't taken a class on cross-cultural psychology or cross-cultural anthropology, I hope you have an opportunity to someday. Right? There is certainly important variability. But there's also a lot of commonalities across cultures that are really important as well. We tend to take them for granted, of course. So the fact that we have marriage in every society, that we tend to live in pretty large groups, right? That we tend to have positive relations with the kin in those groups, that we have rites of passage, that there are in-group and out-group distinctions. The Tacidae, by the way, were a hoax. Anthropologists were very gullible to fall for it, for a while at least. Cooking and tool making, those occur in every society. A sexual division of labor, where men and women do somewhat different things each day, occurs in every society. So it suggests there's a lot more to human nature than just the capacity to learn. There are certain kinds of societies that we thrive in. Okay. So the point I've made then is that the blank slate really was a dominant view, an important view in early 20th century social science. But I also want to make the point that the blank slate is still with us today in various pockets of the social sciences in different areas. So some of you might have heard of the deliberate practice model of expertise, sometimes known as the 10,000-hour rule. How many of you have heard of that? A few of you. And the idea of this rule is that talent doesn't exist. Only training matters. Doing a lot of training, doing the right kind of training, that's the key to developing true expertise. Okay. It's been made popular by Malcolm Gladwell, among others, a best-selling author. Okay. And the idea is that really, these people claim, Carl Anders Ericsson, Gladwell, that any of us could be a concert pianist, a chess grandmaster, or even a slam dunk champion if we worked hard enough at what we were trying to accomplish and get the proper coaching and feedback. So Spud Webb, I remember, he made a big impression on me. I was about 14 at the time when he did a 360 slam dunk despite only being 5'6". According to this theory, any of us could do it if we trained hard enough to. Okay. Of course, the reality is that this theory is wrong. Right? Training, of course, matters. It almost always matters a great, great deal. But in lots of situations, talent matters a lot too. So we've done some research on this recently, Mike Lombardo and I, my colleague at Grand Valley. And the basic story is that we looked at the biographies of Olympic champions, men and women. We looked at the biographies of the fastest 20 men in the United States in terms of U.S. history. We surveyed NCAA qualifiers in the sprints in 2012. And the basic story is the same for everybody. Every one of these elite sprinters was outstanding as soon as they began. Before they had done any training whatsoever, they were already the fastest in their school, usually the fastest in their district. Okay? And many of them actually achieved world-class times with only a few years of training. Okay. So the blank slate's important there. The blank slate is still pervasive or influential in the study of sex and gender differences. Right? For example, men and women obviously differ as adults in many ways, but did you know that even as newborns, boys tend to have slightly greater activity levels than girls? There's overlap. It's not like you can judge someone based on that at all. There's a great deal of overlap. But the differences are there pretty consistently. 9 different studies have found that same effect. There's even studies prior to birth, already boys are more active in the womb. Right? You won't find any of these kinds of things discussed, though, in sex and gender difference textbooks. So one of the projects that I've done with Ben and Bo Weingard, former GRCC alumni, and they're doing PhDs now at various places in the United States, we did a study looking at the common sex and gender textbooks that are used in the United States. And only one of these 15 books mentions that boys and girls are different in the first year. And there's actually a lot of studies. By 6-9 months, on average, there's already some differences. But these books don't mention that whatsoever. Okay. So today I'm going to be focusing on sex differences in sports, and hopefully now you can understand how this is really one example or one case study of trying to understand the pervasiveness of the blank slate in the social sciences today, one example of it. So it's relevant to Title IX policy. Title IX basically says there have to be equal opportunities for men and women in education, including in sports. So today, the implementation of that means that there have to be about the same number of men and women participating on college campuses in intercollegiate sports. So that implementation rests on a blank slate assumption that there's no difference in sports interest. Okay? As I've mentioned already, among academics, people like me teaching classes on sex and gender differences throughout the United States, this is the view that prevails. So whether you're looking at psychology of sports textbooks or sex and gender textbooks that mention sports, it's always the same thing. If there's differences, it's only because culture and society made those differences. Okay. A third reason why this is interesting is that the blank slate view may have practical negative consequences. So some of you might know that ACL and MCL injuries, major knee injuries that you often get while playing soccer or basketball, these are horrific things. But women are something like 5 times more likely to suffer from these injuries. So men and women have different strengths and weaknesses in terms of their physical capacities, but one of women's weaknesses happens to be in the knee. But this has been denied by the Women's Sports Foundation, or downplayed, according to journalist Michael Sokolov, because it didn't fit the idea that women are just as good as men at sports, so they downplayed it. But in fact, we need to focus on this and try to develop programs that will alleviate these injuries and reduce their risk. And then the last reason why I'm interested in this particular case study is that this thing has what I would call Sinatra significance, right? You all know the song New York, New York, if I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. Right? So for someone who believes in evolutionary theory and thinks this is relevant to our behavior, right, we have a strong theoretical case that boys and men ought to be more interested. The theory says that. So if evolutionary theory is wrong on this one, then maybe it's wrong about everything else too. Right? So it's a really good test case to see, is evolutionary theory right or wrong? All right, so let's get into it a little bit. So first, a few definitions and a few patterns across cultures. So what is a sport? A sport is a game that requires physical skill. And then to back up a moment, what's a game? A game is an organized activity where you have two or more sides competing to win. Okay, and you have to have agreed upon rules. So chess is a game, but it's not a sport because chess doesn't require physical skill. You don't judge someone's chess ability by how well they move the pieces. It's only the decisions that matter. Shuffleboard, on the other hand, it's not a prototypical sport, but it involves physical skill, so it is a sport. Sports occur in all or nearly all societies that have been well studied. Okay? A lot of sports require combat or hunting skills like running or wrestling, tackling or throwing. And a lot of sports involve teams, but not all do. Okay? And then finally, there are judged sports, what I might call display sports, such as gymnastics, figure skating, or diving. These only apparently occur in large modern societies. So I'm not going to be focusing on them today. These sports probably don't show a sex difference in terms of interest. If anything, girls and women are probably more interested in participating. I'm focusing on the more prototypical masculine sports that we typically think of when we think of sports. So for someone who takes an evolutionary approach like myself, why do we play sports? It's been an important question. What are the ideas? There's really three of them. The first one is that sports function as culturally invented courtship rituals that advertise quality to members of the opposite sex. So in the same way that the peahen goes around and evaluates the train of various peacocks and decides which one has the most impressive set of feathers and chooses who to mate with on that basis, people have suggested that sports do the same thing. Right? So these two people here are both pretty attractive, but when we see them playing their sport, we might find them far more attractive. Right? So Michelle Kwan and Calvin Johnson. So this is one idea. I don't even think it's the best hypothesis or the most strongly supported, but it's certainly one of them. The second idea is that sports function as physical competitions for status, but they differ from unrestrained combat because they reduce the risk of physical harm to competitors, and they more efficiently reveal to everybody else who's good at these contests. Right? So I'm putting the picture of the Rams up here, butting heads. The idea is they're figuring out who's really strongest, but hopefully at the end of the contest, they're both going to still be totally fine. Right? So this ritual reveals the strength without the danger. And the idea is that boxing matches, arm wrestling, everything else does the same thing, and there's always people taking careful notice to evaluate the skills of other people. Right? So that we can think about this happening for individuals. It can also happen at the group level as well. So lacrosse is one good example. It's been played by many Native American tribes. So among the Iroquois, they had a confederation of different nations that would get together and fight off the Hurons or the French or the English. So they needed to stay together. They didn't want to have an all-out battle, and they would often settle the disputes among them using lacrosse. So they would sort of reveal their qualities, yet not have to pay the cost in terms of death and major injuries. So I don't know if you can see it very well here, but there's supposed to be hundreds of warriors shown in this picture, all playing a massive game of lacrosse. A third idea is that sports function to build the skills necessary for physically demanding activities, especially warfare and hunting. Okay, this idea goes back a long way. It's almost certainly correct to some extent. Right? So sports like archery and wrestling, it's very clear in many cultures that these serve this purpose of developing skills for warfare and hunting. Okay. So given that these are the three things that people think sports are useful for, and the evidence, which I don't have time to go through today, but the evidence seems to suggest that number 2 and 3 are the strongest, I'm going to suggest that boys and men, on average, should have a greater inborn predisposition, right, to be motivated, to be interested in participating in watching sports, especially the sports involving combat-relevant skills and team play. Okay. Now, the reason I have that hypothesis is that throughout history, men have been more involved in physical contests, extreme physical aggression, warfare, cooperative hunting. And I don't have time to go through all the evidence today, but I want to give you a hint of some of the strong pieces. So homicide is one thing that people have looked at when trying to understand patterns of aggression across society because unlike assaults, there's a clear record if somebody kills somebody else. People remember that. It's unambiguous. So Daly and Wilson have studied homicide across countries, and one of the most clear patterns they found is that it's primarily a man-on-man thing. Most homicides are men killing other men. And you can look over there, whether you're talking about modern societies like Iceland, Denmark, Detroit, Pittsburgh, or talking about hunters and gatherers such as the Kung, it's primarily men. 95% to 97% of cases involve men killing other men. Most of this violence, as far as anthropologists can tell, are about men competing with each other for status or honor. Right? So why would the fight result in one man killing each other when their disagreement was about a $5 bet that one of them hadn't paid the other? It's only $5. Well, it's about more than $5. It's about status. Right? So status is important to men because it correlates strongly with reproductive success, how many ancestors you leave behind. Status strongly correlates with this. We know this across human societies. For women, reproductive success varies, but status doesn't seem to be so important, or at least status linked to physical competition. Warfare, men have been much more likely to be involved in warfare for all of known history. Even in modern societies where women are participating in combat forces, it's still primarily a male thing in terms of getting into combat. So for instance, in the United States, women are more involved in combat than ever before, but even in our current military campaigns, they're only about 2% of the casualties. Okay? I'm not saying this is bad or good or that women should have a larger or smaller role. My point here is simply that over human history, warfare has primarily been a male activity as far as being the perpetrators. The victims, of course, have been male and female. Cooperative hunting, men have been much more involved in this as well over human evolutionary history, or so it seems. So this is data from Frank Marlowe, who summarized data from 37 hunters and gatherers. And over on the left here, we have more gathering things. And the idea is that if you read the figure, these societies were all classified on a 5-point scale. So gathering vegetal food is primarily done by women or mostly done by women in most of these societies. By contrast, if you come over to killing or hunting large land fauna, the kudu, the eland, right? What you see in the videos of the African men going out to hunt, these really are activities done primarily by men. So in 33 societies, in 4 cases, these activities were mostly done by men, and in 29, these were only done by men. And then there's also societies where they hunt large aquatic fauna. That mainly means whales, right? Huge amount of meat, if you can get it, a very dangerous thing to do. It's only done by men. Okay. So throughout history, men have been more involved in these things, and we can see this in the legacies today, right, in terms of our bodies and our behavior. So men, as we mentioned, have much greater upper body strength than women on average. Okay? And although we're not as big, the size difference between men and women is not like the silverback gorilla and the female gorilla. Right? There's still a big difference. So even though men are about 10% taller, upper body strength is much different. And some people have pointed out we're actually one of the more sexually dimorphic species. Big differences. And this, of course, translates into being faster, being able to jump higher on average. Okay? We also see this in terms of what are called secondary sexual characteristics, things that come on that distinguish men and women at puberty. So at puberty, men develop traits like deep voices, beards, heavy jaws. It doesn't necessarily make them more attractive, but it makes them more threatening. Women's bodies change as well, but not in ways that make them more threatening. Okay? So these traits, fit into the idea of male-male competition as having an influence, or has had an influence. We also see this in terms of boys having greater tendencies to be involved in play fighting and rough and tumble play and forming large groups competing against other groups. All the information across all societies is consistent with the idea that there's an average sex difference there. So here's one example. So Janet Lever in 1971 went to an elementary school in Connecticut and got data from teachers, from children, and also did regular observations of the recesses. And boys were playing team sports about 3 times as much as girls. And this is still what we found in 2011, about a 3-to-1 ratio. Okay. Another point is that this boy-typical behavior, right, is known to be partly caused by prenatal hormones. Okay? And some of you might have heard about the case of David Reimer. Have any of you talked about this, sometimes called the Joan John case? The idea is that there were twin boys born in Winnipeg in the late 1960s, and they both were circumcised, and they screwed up the circumcision. They totally mangled one of the boys' penises, or his penis, whatever it is. So the doctors decided, well, the easiest thing to do if he can't have a normal penis is to raise him as a girl. Let's start giving him some female hormones. Let's give him a surgery to adjust his genitalia, and we'll tell him and tell his parents to raise him as a girl. So John Money and other scientists pushed the idea that this child was a normally adjusted girl. But the reality finally came to light. He never felt like a girl. His interests were masculine. He eventually identified as a male. And that's the picture of when he was 14 years old, first identifying as a male. Okay. So that's only one example. But there's many others suggesting that these prenatal hormones do have a large role in producing male typical behavior. So there's the case of David Reimer. There's a second case described in the literature as well. There's many cases of what's called cloacal exstrophy. And basically, these are severe birth defects, and there's nothing resembling a normal penis for these boys. And for a while, the typical treatment was to raise them as girls. But in pretty much every case, these boys came to identify as boys. They had male typical interests. A third example is in the case of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And due to different genetic defects, sometimes boys or girls are exposed to really high levels of prenatal testosterone prior to birth. And when this happens, their behavior as they grow up and even as adults tend to be somewhat more masculine than is that of other girls. Okay. There's a couple other lines of evidence as well, but for the sake of time, we'll skip them. So there's a lot of evidence that throughout history, men and boys have been doing more of these things that might be involved in sports. And then we have lots of evidence in terms of the legacies, in terms of body shape, secondary sexual characteristics, behavior, and the role of prenatal hormones. Okay. So what about the evidence from sports? Are boys and men really more interested? Okay. Well, we've got a lot of evidence suggesting they are. First, if you look at the historical record, historians have been interested in sports for a long period of time. And in the books that have focused on sex, girls and women's sports, they do talk about them. There's been a lot of meaningful and interesting sports played by girls and women. But there's almost always a difference. In fact, this quote here is from the first line of Gutman's book. And the idea of this book here was to celebrate women's sports. It says, "Women's sports, a history." Right? This is the first sentence of the entire book. There's never been a time from the dawn of our civilization to the present when women have been as involved in sports as participants or as spectators as men have. Okay? So that was, I think he's the best recognized historian on this. Cross-cultural studies, when people have looked at different societies across time and even in present day, suggest that there's a substantial difference. As I mentioned, anthropologists like to celebrate the exotic and the unusual and talk about it and document it. But no reversed society where girls and women are playing sports more than boys and men, or even any equal society, has ever been described. Okay. And then finally, one of my students and I in 2012 did a formal direct study of this using ethnographic materials. I should mention, I got the idea for this when I was at the Chicago Field Museum in 2010 with my daughter. I don't know if you guys have ever been to the Pawnee Earth Lodge there. It's an old exhibit, a really fantastic exhibit. Anyhow, one of the guides was telling us about shinny, which is basically like field hockey that was played by girls and women in lots of Native American societies. So I got the idea that we ought to do a research project on this. And we were able to do it because a lot of the ethnographic materials from anthropologists, explorers, they're all online now. You can search for them systematically. So we did this, and the basic story is that we found female sports did occur in many traditional societies, but there were always more male sports that were described in every society where we had any data, 50 of them. And we found that the combat and hunting sports were almost exclusively done by males. Okay? So this is our data combining it from all the different societies together. So if you look at amusements, which are non-competitive games like hide and seek, ring around the rosy, there were a lot that were played by both boys and girls in green. Some activities, some amusements done only by boys, some only done by girls. Right? But the story was much different when you look at the games. The strategy games, such as chess, the chance games like roulette, there were more boys and men interested there. And in terms of sports, where there were lots of games described, lots of games involving physical activity, a big sex difference. So the point is that the anthropologists were watching girls and women. They documented the amusements that girls were doing, but they were not doing many sports, and not as many as men were doing. And this is just the data for sports that involve specific combat or hunting skills. So archery, we call the hunting skill. Wrestling was a combat sport, and there are many others of these described. And these almost always involve men. There were a few cases where women were doing wrestling in some societies. Okay. In contemporary societies, there's lots of questionnaire studies suggesting that males say they're more interested. They say it's more important to them. They're more interested in watching. They're more interested in playing. And every relevant study that I've ever seen, and I've looked at this for a long time now, finds this difference. Okay? And then the final piece of evidence is that I mentioned there are some girls that have been exposed to high levels of testosterone before they're born. Right? And when people have looked at their interests, they have more typical interests, including they're more interested in the prototypical masculine sports, hockey, football, and so on. Okay? So have I convinced you? Some of you probably yes. Some of you are still, well, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle here, Rob. What about Title IX? Hasn't the United States shown that this difference can easily be erased? There's been such great strides that have been made, right? So this is data looking at high school and collegiate participation from the early 1970s till the present, okay, or at least 2010. And you can see that high school sports participation has increased dramatically for women. So the y-axis is the percentage of athletes that are female. So in the 1970s, 95% of the athletes were male. Right? Now females comprise 42% of high school athletes, and there are 43% of collegiate varsity athletes. And of course, now there's professional women's sports, and basketball's been going on for a while, and there's been softball and soccer and several others as well. Doesn't this show that there's not much of a difference and that it's easily going away? Right? And as I mentioned, all this is in the wake of the passage of Title IX. Right? There have to be equal opportunities for men and women in everything related to education, including sports. So the idea, again, of Title IX, or at least the current implementation, is that if you build it, they will come. If we provide the opportunities, there will be equal interest. Right? And it seems like, yeah, this data shows it. Right? Well, I think Title IX is great. It's terrific for my daughters. It has had many positive benefits, but I don't think it actually means what a lot of people think it does. And in fact, I would claim that the evidence suggests that maybe Title IX hasn't affected female sports interests whatsoever. Right? Well, how could that be? Well, let's go back to Joan Benoit, right? An incredibly talented and competitive athlete. In fact, if you read her biography, you'll be amazed again and again. So she talks about how she has dulled feeling in her fingers and toes because when she was a 5-year-old girl skiing, trying to keep up with her older brothers, she would not get off the slopes because she wanted to be just as tough as them and ski just as well as them. And even today, in her 50s, she still runs really fast. She qualified for the Olympic trials in 2008. She was still running about 250, right? So an incredibly competitive, talented athlete. But Title IX didn't help her. Title IX was signed when she was in high school, but it wasn't implemented until many years later. For a long time, people didn't realize that Title IX applied to sports, right? So she was already a standout athlete, a highly competitive athlete, before Title IX had any effect. She never got any college recruitment or scholarships. She just was, the best runner around. Okay? So what I'm suggesting is that prior to Title IX, there was a lot of female sports interest. After Title IX, girls and women could express this, right? And female interest, although substantial, has always been less than male interest. That's what I'm claiming or suggesting. Still, you're wondering, what about those percentages? Don't they show that there's really not much of a difference? I don't think so. I think those are highly misleading because on average, a boy or man who's participating probably has substantially stronger interest than is a comparable girl or woman. Right? So as I mentioned, questionnaires suggest that boys and men say they value sports more than girls and women do. Questionnaire studies always find that. Men and boys are more interested to report watching sports and being sports fans. Again, very consistent. Some people have said, well, these questionnaire studies can't be trusted. Gina Davis, some of you might have seen her in Thelma and Louise, sticking up for women's power and throwing off the patriarchy and all that. She's been one critic of people saying these questionnaire studies can tell us anything. She said, well, if you're going to limit the opportunities for girls and women based on questionnaires, then I'm here to take you on a short ride in Thelma and Louise's car. And so if you see the movie, you know what that's all about. And so people say, well, you can't really trust these questionnaire studies. So what I began to do was find the actual data on how boys and girls, men and women, are participating in the United States. Is there actually a big difference? is it bigger than what you get when you look at the organized participation in high school and college? So we used a few different data sets. The first was this one, the American Time Use Study. This is conducted by the US government, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. We have data from many years. It's a huge data set, and it's based on telephone interviews. They contact people and tell them, in a few days, we're going to call you at 8 in the morning, and we want you to give us a complete rundown of everything you did for the prior 24 hours. And they get almost everybody to participate because they promised them, $100 in groceries or some inducement like that. And they've shown that these really have good methods. They've done everything they can to minimize the biases. And the data is public, so we could use it. This is the kind of study that would tell you something like how many hours a day do Americans spend in their cars commuting or watching television, or that women do more housework than men, and things like that. So it's a time use study. So what we found is that for exercise, which is what people had previously studied, just overall physical activity, but this is non-competitive activities, there's really no difference for overall exercise. Men do a tiny bit more, but it really varies by age, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. But for certain specific activities, yeah, women do yoga more than men do weightlifting somewhat more than women. This is the number or percentage of people who have played the previous day, right? Percent playing per day. So about 12 or 13% of Americans have exercised in the previous day on average. Okay. When we looked at sports, it was a really different story. Okay. So over there I put the team sports, the most popular team sports, and you can see on average the difference is that men play team sports about 3 times as much. Right? For individual sports, the difference isn't quite as great. So most popular individual sports, golf, racket sports, including tennis. So there's a difference there as well. But for team sports, the difference is really large. Okay? And this is the data if you break it down by age. It's kind of an interesting pattern, I think. So the dashed lines up there, that's exercise. So exercise happens much more than sports. You can see it's running about 12, 15%. So in certain age groups, men are exercising slightly more than women. Sometimes it reverses. But for sports, in the solid line here, in dark blue, right, you can see in high school, boys are playing much more than girls. Girls are playing a lot. This is organized high school sports, which is driving a lot of this. But then look what happens when you get to the 20 to 24 category. This is when people are going off to college. The rates go way down, but they drop far more for women, right? So what I've seen at the different gyms I've been at GVSU and other places where I've been, if you go to the gym, people are exercising on Stairmasters, lifting weights. There's often a basketball court, right? People are playing volleyball or basketball. Who's playing? It's men, right? So after high school, men are continuing to play more than women are. That's what this data is suggesting. Okay? Of course, the amount of sports decreases as you get older. Not that many men are still playing full court basketball or tackle football or anything like that. But the difference is pretty large for young adults. Okay, so one concern that people had about this initial study was that maybe males are biased in their responses, even on that time use study. Maybe they're more likely to say, yeah, I played basketball yesterday, even if they actually didn't. Or maybe they only played for a few minutes and just shot a few hoops and they weren't playing a competitive game. So what we decided to do was make observations at public parks where anybody can go play. So we had observers in 4 different states in the United States. And they were assigned to develop a circuit of parks. Some of them didn't even know what our hypothesis was, that we were interested in sex differences. And they were supposed to record who was exercising or playing sports. And this was supposed to be unstructured activities, so pickup games. If there was a coach there, if there were uniforms, we didn't count that data. And here's the story. Okay, so basketball, soccer, football, these were things we saw quite a bit. And it was men who were playing these games. Okay? So in terms of total sports, males play individual sports, so there was quite a bit of tennis, about 4 times more at public parks. They were playing team sports about 10 times more. I think it's even that, probably an underestimate. And the difference even occurs in soccer and basketball. Those are especially interesting to me because in terms of the number of scholarships given in college, the number of men and women who are playing in high school and college, there's just as many girls and women as men and boys who are playing those sports. There's no equipment that you need for those things that's expensive. Yet who's actually playing in a public space? Boys and men are playing much, much more. The female sports, so they're sports that are played more by females in the United States, like volleyball, field hockey, softball, those don't happen in unstructured settings as far as we could tell, or at least they're very rare. Okay, another question people had was, well, maybe men are somehow preventing women from playing in the public park, right? Because they're intimidating them, they're taking over the game if they're out there and saying, hey, let me show you how it's done or something like that. So we looked at intramural sports in college, and the idea is that there are usually separate divisions for men and women. And also intramural sports are driven by the desire to play. No one's ever going to get a scholarship. If you're a really good athlete, you're not allowed to play. right? If you're actually on if you're on a varsity team. So we looked at this, and first we got data at Grand Valley. So we had 35,000 participations there. And the basic story is that there's more women at Grand Valley, but men actually play about 3 times as much, okay? And this is true for team sports and also for individual sports. And you can see which ones are most popular: basketball, football, soccer, even volleyball. Men play more than women. Is volleyball a varsity sport here in high school? No. In most places in the United States, it's not, at least in most states. But men still play overall more if you take data from across the country. So this is just intramurals at GVSU. We got data from 34 other schools that were willing to share the data with us, and it's the same story. Men play about 3 times as much. In fact, the data we usually had was based on the number of people registering for an intramural sport, which means you sign up once and you play a whole bunch of games throughout the season. Okay? Some of the schools even had data for us on how often people played once they registered. So when finals times come, you decide, I'm not going to go play field hockey tonight or street hockey, whatever you're signed up for, because I'm going to study. Women were more likely to go study. Men were more likely to keep playing. Okay? So it's a big difference, and we found this in every sport, even volleyball. Okay? And these differences were just as large for single sex. So a lot of schools offered single sex basketball and soccer for women. The differences were just as large there. And also 9 of the schools had data for us going back to at least the early 2000s, and there was no evidence that the sex difference was getting any smaller. Okay? So if you take 2 people who are playing high school soccer, you might say, well, they're both playing. They both have equal interest. Well, if you look at what they're saying, right, Joe is more likely to say that being good at soccer is more important, that soccer is interesting, he's going to follow professional soccer, he wants to be on a college soccer team. And Thelma and Louise might say, well, I don't care what they say. Well, now we've shown, in terms of what's being done, right, Joe is more likely to play pickup soccer, more likely to play intramural soccer, more likely to play soccer after college, more likely to watch and become most emotionally invested in professional soccer. So in science, we call this convergent evidence. All these different lines of evidence pointing the same direction. There is a sex difference. Men really are more interested in sports. Right? And if you're not sure, not convinced, you can go gather your own data. You can go to a public park. You can track who's listening to talk radio or magazines, and you'll find the same thing. There really is a difference. So I still haven't contacted the Women's Sports Foundation to tell them that they have to change this from myth to fact, right? That the girls are not as interested in boys. But I think it is a fact. There we go. I made the change. All right, so one response is, well, Rob, yeah, you've shown us that there's a difference, but most of the people talking about this say that this is a historical thing, that there's going to be change over time. We haven't given it long enough. Title IX's only been enforced for maybe 30 years. Right? It's going to take longer. Okay. Well, one point to make is you can always say it hasn't been that long. 40 years or 30 years is a pretty long time. But still, if this hypothesis is right, it does make a prediction. It predicts that the sex difference ought to be getting smaller, right? But there's no evidence for that. So if you look at the high school and collegiate data, what you actually see is that there's been no increase in female participation since about 1998. Of course, this data, as I've said, misrepresents the sex difference. It overestimates it, but looks like stability. The American time use data that we have suggests no change since 2003. We don't have data earlier than that. The intramural data we have, again, suggests there's no convergence happening. We have a study of sport fandom we're doing, which again suggests no difference. I also have a whole bunch of research, which I'll just hit the highlights of, looking at distance running. And the idea is that, I was talking to these guys about this at lunch today, if you look at training and performance, there's a close relationship. And people have different talents, of course, but the more you train in distance running, the better you get. So even though men have advantages, you can still say how many men seem to be training hard compared to how many women seem to be training hard. So our data suggests that for a male running about 50 miles per week, right, that's 7 miles per day, a pretty consistent runner, the typical performance might be running a 5K in about 16:15, which is a very good performance. You'd be, I don't know if you'd be a high school champion, but you'd be one of the best runners in your state probably. So that's about 25% slower than the male world record. And for women, the equivalent is about running 18:25 for a 5K. Okay? And what we found is that there's about 3 times as many males as females that are achieving those relatively fast performances that are, as we argue, equal for males and females in terms of how much training it would take to perform that well. And what we found is this ratio hasn't changed in the United States for at least 30 years. Okay? We also looked at this in road races. So it used to be 5Ks, 10Ks, marathons that men participated about 3 times as much as women. That has changed. But if you look at the small percentage of people that are actually running really fast, that hasn't changed. So, oh, sorry, I don't have a pointer here. I'm going the wrong way now. Give me a moment. Okay, so what I wanted to point out to you is that if you went to 1985 and you went to the local 5K, you might say, sure, there's 3 times as many men participating, but there's the same percentage of people that are running really fast relative to the gender-specific standards. You know, about a fifth of them are. In 2005, the difference in participation has gone away, but the women who are running today are still unlikely to be relatively fast. So in terms of relatively fast runners, men are still outnumbering women by about 3 to 1. Now, some people have said, well, I don't trust that relative performance data. Well, we have other evidence as well. So if you look at masters participation, so road races, we made a comparison between masters track meets and road races. And the idea is that a lot of road races today are more like parades or festivals. Most people are not really competitive. Their questionnaires indicate that. Their slow performances indicate that. There's a very small percentage of people that actually run fast. At track meets, though, that they have for people in my age, I'm 42 now almost, the people that actually show up there to run tend to be highly trained, and they want to win. There's nobody cheering them on. There aren't any bands. People just want to see how fast can they run. And what we found is that the sex difference in masters participation hasn't got any smaller in the past 25 years. So the point is that the women who were running in the 1980s, such as Joan Benoit, Mary Decker, Lynn Jennings, their performances were terrific, just as good as the women today, such as Shailene Flanagan, Desiree Davila, and Kara Goucher. But the number of women running with them has increased dramatically today, but very few of these women are running competitively. That's what our data argues, our data suggests. This is a gratuitous shot of me with Shailene Flanagan and my buddy Andy. She was here in town Saturday, so it was my only time I've ever run with an Olympic marathoner, so I was pretty psyched about that. But anyhow, getting back to the main message here, the hypothesis is that the sex difference ought to be getting smaller, right? But there's no evidence for it from all these different sources. Another question then is like, well, maybe the sex difference, there is one, it hasn't really gone away, but isn't the US at least doing better than other countries? Isn't the sex difference smaller here? So I've tried to look for evidence for this as well, and I've found one study, for instance, that asked about people's favorite subject in school. Boys are more likely to say sports is their favorite subject or physical education. The difference was just as large, or actually larger, in the US than it was in Japan or Taiwan, whereas the prediction would be if the difference was small in the US, the difference should be small. But in fact, the difference is larger in the US. There's time use data from other countries as well, looking at how often people say they play sports. The methods are a little bit different than the time use data we had, but the basic story holds up. Men or males play about 3 times as much as females in every country where there's data so far. Skip that for now. Another question people have asked is, well, what about the girls of summer? The incredible women winning Olympic medals and winning the World Cup in soccer. Doesn't this show that the Title IX had this incredible effect? All this positive performance couldn't be happening unless Title IX was having this amazing effect. Well, we have a study looking at this, looking at Olympic medals won by men and women in different countries. And the basic story is that the US women do incredibly well, but so do the US men. It's nothing to pat ourselves in the back about. We're a very populous, very wealthy country, and if you have those characteristics, you're going to do really well at the Olympics. So the US women are not exceptional. There's no special Title IX effect that we found any evidence for. Okay. Well, another argument people might raise is, well, Title IX doesn't seem to have worked very much here, Rob, but maybe we need to make other changes. That's true. There always could be more changes we need to make. But some of these experiments have been tried. So for instance, having professional sportswomen, would this make a big difference and encourage more women to be more interested in sports? The evidence doesn't really seem to fit. So the WNBA has been around for a long time now, and people really haven't embraced it. It's been successful in terms of it's an outlet for women to play professional sports. The quality of the product is certainly very good. They're very skilled. But the attendance is pretty modest. There's lots of empty seats at almost every game, and the attendance hasn't grown. The television viewership hasn't grown. Right? So I say the experiment's failed in the sense it hasn't shown that there's this untapped interest for women to watch other women play competitive sports. This is also true in terms of sports magazine. This is not a joke. There really was a magazine called Sports Illustrated for Women. It was only around for a few years, though, because nobody bought it. Okay? There's been other magazines like that that have tried to target elite women or tried to show off elite women athletes, and women simply haven't been interested in buying those magazines. All right, so I want to try to wrap up now. So the data support the evolved male predisposition hypothesis. Men have evolved to be more interested in sports than women have, not a blank slate position that there's no difference. There's still a lot more research that needs to be done, looking at changes over the time and looking at variation across societies. And I want to make the point that even though I haven't, whoops, wasn't quite right. Let me see. Mouse. All right, let's go back right here. I want to make the point that there's meaningful variation across cultures, and this is compatible with my view. It's compatible with evolutionary theory. So I mentioned the study before we did across societies, Brant Smith and I did. We found there was more male sports and female sports in every society, but in the societies where there was patriarchy, where men controlled all the resources, men decided who was marrying whom, men controlled the politics, in patriarchal societies, for the most part, there was no sports going on. In non-patriarchal societies, like a lot of the Native American societies, there were sports, right? So patriarchy seems to matter in terms of expressing or having this interest. So this variation, I acknowledge it. It's important. We need to study it. But we always expect males to be more interested. And we're still doing a bunch of other studies trying to address this, but it seems likely we'll find this difference is pretty consistent. A few non-implications. People sometimes misread what I'm saying when I deliver this talk. This hypothesis doesn't imply that female athletes aren't dedicated or committed to their sports. Obviously, many of them certainly are. I'm saying that there's more men like that, though. Okay? The fact that this seems to be true, it doesn't make men better than women, right? Competitiveness, being interested in sports, there's benefits, there's costs, there's pros and cons. I'm not saying Title IX should be abolished. That's not the point at all. Title IX had many positive effects here. The point, though, is that for every girl who's interested in playing at a high level, there seems to be a whole bunch of boys that are as well, and we have to acknowledge that. So it's probably a mistake to base Title IX implementation on the assumption that males and females have, or soon will have, equal interest. It doesn't seem like that's the case. Going back to the blank slate, the big picture here. So the blank slate, it remains a popular idea, right? And it's false. Data consistently contradicts it when people are willing to look at the data. Okay? As I've mentioned, this blank slate can have negative consequences. We talked about females' heightened injury rates, for instance. Physical education programs might be more effective if they acknowledged that competition, on average, will be more likely to appeal to boys than to girls. People have talked about bringing Title IX thinking in terms of quotas and goals for having female representation to the sciences. There's a lot of good that comes from that, but we should also recognize there can be negatives. So it means that more women will end up studying things that they aren't actually interested in. Right? And then the fourth negative is that dogmatic allegiance, sort of convincing yourself that something is right that's not right. It's going to undermine the public from taking social scientists like me seriously if we perpetrate false things as being true. Okay? So lastly, the blank slate, it obscures a true understanding of human nature. We want to understand what our nature is really like, and part of our nature is that men and women on average are somewhat different. And I hope I've illustrated that for you today. Thanks for your attention. I hope we have some time for questions. Okay, great. Is there a mic you want to pass around, or? Okay. Anybody have a question? Everyone buy what I said 100%? I can't imagine.
This isn't a class. You don't have to be afraid to ask.
I just want to make sure people understand Title IX does not require that you have equal protection. It's providing equal opportunity, and you don't have to be protecting you.
You don't, but in practice, that's how they usually determine it, right? In terms of the 3 tiers, colleges know if they've got 51% of their students are female, they better make sure at least 48% of their athletes are female, right? True, but people know they're incredibly in danger of being in trouble if they don't.
That's what I don't agree with, because doing an interest survey to see what, and then you do not have any other people that are interested in it, allowing you to meet that one prong, and that's the only prong you have to meet. So it doesn't have to be based on participation.
Right. So in theory, you're right. In practice, I think you're wrong. If you look what's happening in terms of how lawsuits go, I think you're wrong. Right. But I mean, still, the way it's implemented, people assume girls and women are equally as interested, or they soon will be, right? So I'm not really so much concerned with exactly how to implement Title IX. I'm trying to take a step back and say, hold on here, our whole underlying assumption doesn't make any sense in terms of all the data and all the theory we have from all these other fields.
I'm not saying it has to be for research, I'm just saying there are other ways schools can show that
Sure, yeah.
they, by their mentality.
Okay, that's a fair point. Other questions? Clarification? Yeah, we're here. Okay, I should have repeated the question before. The question was, have there been any studies looking at transgender kids and their interest in sports, perhaps? Not that I know of. You know, there's increasing research on transgender individuals now, but there hasn't been that much, and part of the reason that these individuals are pretty rare. So for instance, homosexuality, maybe 1 to 3% of people are homosexual. Transgender, it's more like 1 in 10,000. It's very difficult to have a large sample of individuals to do a study like that, but I'm sure there will be studies of that. It's getting a lot more attention recently. Yeah. Other questions? Somebody must have been irritated or disagree with something else I said. Okay, where do I go next? That's a good question. Maybe you guys will have some ideas for me. We have a bunch of other studies, but I'm trying to think. The general thing is I'm going to try to do more research into textbooks and sort of research papers, trying to show that this blank slate claim is correct, that really everybody who teaches anything about sex difference in sports seems to really hold this view, trying to find out if that's really true or not. So that's an important thing. I think in terms of the research, it's pretty clear that there's a difference here, but I'm more curious, why are people unwilling to confront that? Yeah. Frank?
Similar question. Assuming that we all have a static level of interest in human beings, what's the counter interest in women versus men? If men have
Yeah.
propensity for sports, particularly
Right.
competitive sports,
Yeah.
and women don't, what are they interested in?
That's a great question. So what are women interested in sort of as a counter to sports? I guess a lot of things. I mean, in terms of media consumption, right? Men are more interested than women in watching sports, right? And that doesn't seem to be because no one's ever put women's sports on television. They have. They've tried to make money on ESPN and other channels, and Oprah and other people have put the WNBA on. People weren't interested in watching. But what are women interested in watching? You guys know better than me. Too busy, right? But there's lots of women's television shows. What do they sell? What do they focus on? There's cooking, there's fashion, there's celebrity magazines, right? Focusing on gossip and fashion. So, you know, my wife says, I'm going to Sports Illustrated. She's going to go check out People magazine, right? It's both sort of brain candy for you. It's completely meaningless, but we tend to enjoy it anyhow. So it's kind of a diffuse answer. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the argument here is that women aren't interested in physical activity. They are. And I think as a society, our goal should be to increase physical activity for everybody. If people want to do it competitively, great. A lot of people don't. So we should try to figure out what's the situation that will get people to become more physically active. So my wife never liked going to gym class. Gym classes still tend to be highly competitive. She never thought of herself as an athlete. Now she's been doing Zumba for 3 years late. That's been, you know, three years, not 3 years straight, but on and off for 3 years. And she's really enjoying it. So it's great if people can find the activities that match up to their own interests and abilities. Over here.
What significant change do you want to see happen?
As I mentioned, you know, I'm interested in Title IX, but I'm really not trying to say I've got the answers for how we should do college sports. I don't think it's really it's nothing I'm going to fix, that's for sure. So I'm more interested in the blank slate in general, and why is it that social scientists sometimes get on these things that are far from reality, right? So that's what I'm trying to explore. In back?
Do you think it's, have you done any data collecting to see if maybe women, you know, like in high school, and then they kind of stabilize where men continue to build muscle mass, and so as they continue to perform and get better and better, where women kind of start tapering off, and that's why they can't drop.
Yeah, so the question is, maybe women are peaking earlier physically. I think that does matter for a lot of sports. For distance running, when women hit puberty, they tend to put on more body fat. So I know in distance running, which I know well, a lot of women who are winning state championships and things are doing really well in 8th and 9th grade, and they don't do as well when they get to 10th and 11th grade, when they start turning into women. So I think that can be important for some sports, but I don't think it explains the whole picture at all because, I mean, there's men who are in their 40s, women are in their 40s, and men are more likely to say, I'm going to go down to the Y and pick up basketball, whereas women are more likely to go to the aerobic studio. So that is part of the picture, yeah. Good question. Good point. Others? Yep. Yeah, let's see if we can do that. Here? Okay. Oh. Anybody else? Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your attention and your thoughts. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming. Hope to see you next semester at the next speaker series.